commitment to reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. And it may be helpful to inform the House that this debate is likely to run until about 3:45. And I call Siobhan McDonough to move.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I begin by thanking the Backbench Committee for approving the debate, and the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton and the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for co-sponsoring it. I proudly declare my interest as the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Tamil Community. For 12 long years since the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, I have stood alongside my Tamil constituents on the road to truth, justice and accountability. 12 years that has presented them with so many challenges, so little progress and so much pain. The images of those final days of the Civil War are scarred on my memory. No one who saw could possibly forget. The mass violation of human rights left a stain of injustice on Sri Lanka. The world looked away, but today we will not. Mr Deputy Speaker, I introduce today's debate by running through a decade-long quest for justice. I will continue the last UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka, a resolution the country themselves disappointingly withdrew from, and I will finish by highlighting the urgent need to strengthen the new resolution currently on the table in Geneva. Because the measure of success for global Britain comes not just in rhetoric, but in the actions that we take on the international stage, particularly in the face of international justice. But first, the history. In 2009, in the final few months of Sri Lanka's civil war, tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives. We all remember the horror of the Mullawaikal massacre, the most recent peak of genocidal killings against the Tamil people committed by the Sri Lankan state. Current Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa was president, and his brother Gotabaya, the current president, was Defence Secretary. They are the present-day link to the atrocities of the past. The bombing of the government-designated no-fire zone where Tamil civilians took refuge is as utterly horrifying today as it was those 12 years ago. As are the big findings of the expert, the government forces even systematically shelled hospitals. Mr Deputy Speaker, Amnesty International estimates that since the 1980s, there have been at least 60,000 and as many as 100,000 cases of enforced disappearance in Sri Lanka, the vast majority from the Tamil community. These figures illustrate the scale of the suffering, the uncertainty surrounding the facts, and the urgent need for resolution. Members will have heard of the horror of rape, torture and murder used during the Civil War. Stories of the mass violations of women's rights, stories that brought the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women to urge investigations into sexual violence, stories we could never forget. But to this day, no one has been held accountable for international crimes committed, crimes that have led many to accuse the Sri Lankan government of genocide against the Tamil community. The pursuit of justice must now move decisively forward with more sincerity from the international community. The Human Rights Council meeting happening right now provides the perfect opportunity. Before turning to today's resolution, it is important to consider the resolution that came before. Passed in 2015 with the consensus of Sri Lanka, the previous resolution promised the establishment of a process of justice, accountability, reform and reconciliation. But 6 years on, and Sri Lanka has made clear that it has absolutely no intention of pursuing prosecutions or legal redress for war crimes. Their withdrawal from the process altogether could not have spelt this out more clearly. The little progress made rolled right back. The ongoing Human Rights Council meeting is our chance to finally secure progress, making clear that a country cannot fail to fulfil international commitments. To do so risks undermining the credibility of the Council as a mechanism of accountability. I turn to the current resolution, to which the UK is a penholder. Mr Deputy Speaker, it disappointingly falls short. First, there is no recommendation to pursue criminal accountability by referral to the International Criminal Court. I could barely believe my eyes reading the government's reasoning, citing insufficient Security Council support. Who are we to cast the veto for China or Russia before they have done so themselves? Our role on the international stage must be to send the loudest message that impunity will not be tolerated, not to preempt the inaction of other nations. Second, there is a clear need for an international, impartial and independent mechanism to investigate the most serious international crimes. The Minister may point to Resolution Operative Paragraph 6, but can he confirm whether preparation of files in order to facilitate criminal proceedings will be carried out in accordance with international criminal law standards? The resolution must absolutely clear the requirement to establish triple IM mechanism to investigate allegations of war crimes, secure evidence, identify perpetrators and prosecute those responsible. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights should continue to monitor and report on the human rights in Sri Lanka, providing recommendations to ensure justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators. To rely, as the Foreign Office argues, on the Sri Lankan government to investigate and prosecute all allegations of gross human rights violation is simply unrealistic, falling far short of our moral responsibility. Third, sanctions. Why haven't we applied sanctions against those credibly accused of gross human rights violations? The US has designated General Silva and his immediate family over his role in the extrajudicial killing of Tamils. It's an immediate step we could take, and the Minister cannot point to a veto as an excuse for our inaction. We must ensure a coherent approach to aid, trade, diplomatic and military engagement with Sri Lanka, consistent with the international obligations to human rights. It is long overdue. But it is the present day where I now turn. Mr. Deputy Speaker, human rights are again under attack in Sri Lanka, with President Rajapaksa waging a campaign of war. Many of those who face serious wartime abuse allegations have been appointed to senior government positions. Members of the Rajapaksa family hold nine ministerial roles, including 7 cabinet posts, managing almost a quarter of the budget, its total control. President Rajapaksa even pardoned one of few members of the security forces to be convicted of human rights violations, Saja Sunanul Ratanaka. Unsurprisingly, considering his stated determination to protect so-called war heroes during the presidential campaign. This intimidation is perhaps best symbolised in January's demolition of the Mutlikaval Memorial in Jaffna University. That same month, the High Commissioner for Human Rights' damning report warned that Sri Lanka was on an alarming path towards recurrence of grave human rights violations, calling on the Human Rights Council to take strong action to promote accountability and reconciliation. And it's not just the human rights of Tamils. The Rajapaksa government even insisted on forced cremation for those who had died from coronavirus, disregarding the religious beliefs of the Christians and Muslim communities in the country. The ongoing attacks on human rights is undeniable, and as a penholder to the resolution, the world will watch closely the strength of our response. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I look around the chamber and unless I'm mistaken, I cannot see the Foreign Secretary. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. He repeatedly declined to meet with the APPG for Tamils in the build-up to the Council meeting. Minister, with all due respect, where is he? Under the last Labour government, our Foreign Secretary personally flew to Sri Lanka at the end of the Civil War, pressing for a ceasefire. His absence not only today, but in the months leading up to the Human Rights Council meeting will be felt strongly by the Tamil community. and it is to them that I am turning before concluding. There are 500,000 Tamils across the UK. They are hard-working, respectful and dedicated community who have my utmost respect. We owe a debt of thanks to the huge number of Tamils working tirelessly on the front line of our NHS. I sincerely thank them, and I say loud and clear that however long the road to reconciliation may still be, we will keep fighting for justice and human rights until they are achieved.
The question is, as on the order paper, video link and 4-minute limit. Elliot Colburn.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thanks also to the Backbench Business Committee for scheduling this debate this afternoon, and indeed to my constituency neighbour, the member for Mitcham and Morden, for opening this afternoon's debate so well. As chair of the APPG for Tamils, and indeed as the largest ethnic minority group in Carshalton and Wallington is Tamil, I'm especially pleased to be speaking in this afternoon's debate to urge the government to do all it can to secure peace and accountability in Sri Lanka. I want to thank colleagues from across the House who've worked with me on the APPG this past year, and to Tamils from Carshalton and Wallington, the United Kingdom and around the world who have been in touch with us and shared their stories. In the short time I've got available to me, which isn't nearly enough to cover everything, I will try to get straight to the point. 6 years ago, it was the UK government who paved the way in addressing human rights abuses in Sri Lanka and successfully pushed for UN resolutions to pursue accountability and reconciliation on the island. UN resolutions that the then Sri Lankan government signed up to. However, sadly, since that time, Sri Lanka have withdrawn their support for these resolutions, and the evidence collected by the APPG from the many evidence sessions we've had this past year have painted a very worrying story of the picture on the ground. As the member for Mitcham and Morden has outlined, recent infringements on human rights have been on the rise. These have included the forced cremations of COVID-19 victims, regardless of their religious beliefs, causing grief and anguish to Sri Lankan Christians, Muslims and others. The Police Criminal Investigation Department has been repeatedly visiting members of advocacy groups on the island who are campaigning for justice following the disappearance of their family members during the war. The Terrorism Investigation Department has been increasing state surveillance culture, especially in the North Tamil populated part of the island. The state-supported demolition of a Tamil memorial monument at Jaffna University and attempts to prevent Tamil memorial events from taking place at all have been causing anguish amongst the community. Occupying private land in the name of security and so much more. It is clear that there is no scope at this present time for a domestic accountability mechanism in Sri Lanka, so the UK must once again demonstrate its global leadership on this issue to support an international accountability mechanism. The initial zero draft resolution published by the UK in February and presented to the UNHRC fell well short of providing the action that was needed. I do welcome, after efforts from Tamils in the UK and abroad, campaign groups and indeed the APPG, that following drafts of the resolution have included a requirement to collect evidence on human rights abuses rather than just looking at what is already there, and acknowledge that Tamils for the first time have that Tamils have been particularly victim to worsening human rights abuses on the island. I do welcome these changes, but I urge the SCDO to listen to the calls we are making today. There is so much more that needs to be done, so we must act now before the conclusion of the UNHRC session at the end of the month to ensure that there is a true international accountability mechanism in place. Only then can we hope to bring about truth, justice, reconciliation and accountability for all in Sri Lanka, as well as the Tamil diaspora, not just in Carshalton and Wallington, but across the world.
Video link. Matthew Offord.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I start by highlighting my chairmanship of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's relationship with the rest of the world has been strongly shaped since the end of the conflict by allegations that the army committed war crimes and crimes against humanity during the final phase of the civil war. A UN panel of experts reported in April 2011 that there were credible allegations of those crimes by both government and Tamil Tiger forces. It remains my opinion that both sides were at fault. However, I do regret the government of Sri Lanka's decision to withdraw support for the UNHCR Resolution 30/1 and note that previous domestic initiatives have failed to deliver meaningful accountability. Therefore, I urge the Sri Lankan government to engage in a process that has the confidence of all on the island. But it would be remiss to state that the current Sri Lankan government has failed to act. The Office of Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations are to be retained and strengthened so that communities may build trust. It will be good to see reform of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and progress on the release of political prisoners too. We must act as a critical friend to the country. We need to help to strengthen democratic institutions, and we must trust Sri Lanka to develop their own judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. Since the end of the conflict, reconciliation has occurred between Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim communities. People are able to live wherever they wish. They benefit from state resources such as free education and health services. Private land that was occupied by the military has been returned, and former conflict areas have been demined with assistance from the United Kingdom. And over 12,000 ex-LTTE cadres have been rehabilitated. And there is a greater connectivity throughout the island and indeed globally, all of which have transformed the business sector and the lives of everyone in the country. But we should remember that resolution and accountability are not a panacea to address underlying tensions. Questions about how to address the legacy of the Sri Lankan conflict, what kind of justice is attainable, how should the victims of violations be treated in the process, what might punishment look like, and how can justice play a constructive role in forging a lasting peace must all be answered. Draft legislation for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been prepared under the previous Sri Lankan government, and this is an area which could be revisited. If it gains universal support in Sri Lanka, then truth-seeking amongst all stakeholders, including the diaspora in many of our communities and constituencies, could make a lasting difference. When these issues have been resolved, then a sustainable and acceptable peace will endure. And given the goodwill between our two countries, the United Kingdom and Sri Lanka, I asked the Minister, how can the UK help to facilitate a TRC mechanism that's unique to the needs of Sri Lanka? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. And it may be for the help of those participating either remotely or physically that the wind-ups will begin no later than 3:21 with Anne McLaughlin with 6 minutes, both Stephen Kinnock and Nigel Adams with 8 minutes, and then back over to Siobhan McDonough for 2 minutes at the very end. I hope that is useful. Video link, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the members for Mitcham and Morden for her warm and powerful opening to this debate, the members for Carl Shorten and Wellington and Kingston and Surbiton for securing this debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Ambihai Selvakumar, also known lovingly as Ambi, is a director of the International Centre for Prevention of Genocide. Ambi was on hunger strike just recently in Kenton in Brent. She was on a hunger strike in order to highlight the injustices currently in Sri Lanka. Ambi campaign, in her own words, is a demand for justice for the genocide of Tamils carried out by the Sri Lankan state. Ambi's protest sparked a number of solidarity hunger strikes across the northeast. I hope when the Minister gets to his feet that he will address Ambi's 4 demands, which are: 1. Recommend to the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly that Sri Lanka be referred to the International Criminal Court and take steps to effectively investigate charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. 2. Establish an international independent investigative mechanism, IIIM, akin to those established for Syria and Myanmar, which mandates the evidence of international crimes and human rights violations be collected and prepared for criminal prosecutions. She also states that a meaningful independent investigation must also have a strict time frame. And 3, mandate the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to appoint a special rapporteur to continue to monitor Sri Lanka for ongoing violations and have an on-field presence in Sri Lanka. And the last, Mr. Deputy Speaker, recommend a UN-monitored referendum to determine the aspirations of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka, on the basis that northeast of Sri Lanka is the traditional Tamil homeland and the Tamils have a right to self-determination. I hope that when the Minister gets to his feet that he will address AMPI's demands. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much, Dawn Butler. Video link, Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I declare an interest. In October 2020, the British Tamil Conservatives made a donation to the Harlow Constituency Conservative Association. In the final 5 months of the Sri Lankan conflict, it's estimated that between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians were killed. At the end of the war in 2009, some 280,000 Tamils remained incarcerated in barbed wire camps for years, with thousands of enforced or involuntary disappearances. Mr. Deputy Speaker, their relatives continue to search for their whereabouts and for justice. And 12 years on from the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, little progress has been made to secure justice and autonomy for the Tamil community. Still, there is no real accountability. The Sri Lankan state continues to target the Tamil people in all aspects of their lives through surveillance, but by denying them of their livelihoods, physical security, education, economics, culture, healthcare, freedom of expression, and freedom of worship. In February this year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, issued a report expressing deep concern at the situation in Sri Lanka. And she said, there are clear early warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation and a significantly heightened risk of future violations. So I ask the Minister, what action is this government taking to prevent future cycles of violence and promote autonomy for the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, as forecasted in this latest report from the United Nations? In 2014, the UK led the international efforts that successfully passed a key resolution in the UN Human Rights Council to promote accountability, justice and reconciliation. In 2015, Sri Lanka agreed to co-sponsor a resolution to promote accountability, justice and reconciliation. But despite this pledge and repeated extensions to their deadlines by the UN Human Rights Council members, successive Sri Lankan governments have delayed and obfuscated at every turn. In 2019, Sri Lanka unilaterally withdrew from the resolution, walking away from its international obligations. The Sri Lankan government has repeatedly reneged on its pledges to investigate and prosecute wartime atrocity crimes. Now is the time for strong international action, led by the UK once again, to secure justice for the Tamil community, recognition of the genocide, and a proper accountability mechanism. In February, tens of thousands of people joined one of the largest rallies in the Tamil homeland since the end of armed conflict in 2009. They marched for 5 days from the east to the north of the island, calling for justice. That same month, 500 British Tamil organisations wrote to our Foreign Secretary seeking an independent mechanism for evidence collection and the referral of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. 12 long years have passed. I urge the Minister to listen to the Tamil community here in the UK and in Sri Lanka, to recognise the genocide, secure justice for the Tamil community by taking on board the recommendation of the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights and refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Video link, Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for leading this debate. I'm proud to have worked with her for many years on the APPG, standing up for justice and human rights for Tamil people. Over those years, we've witnessed time and again the Tamil people being harmed by the Sri Lankan government and let down by the international community. Human rights are again under attack in Sri Lanka. Recent reports from numerous human rights organisations, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, paint a disturbing picture. From the appalling treatment of Sri Lanka's Muslim and Christian communities during COVID, when the Sri Lankan government for months prevented burials of their dead in the traditional manner, to the continuing human rights abuses against the Tamil population across the island, things are getting worse as the international community wrings its hands. It is clear that domestic mechanisms for accountability in Sri Lanka have failed again in recent years. They just cannot be relied on. An international mechanism has always been needed to enable allegations of genocide, war crimes, and human rights abuses to be properly examined and investigated. Many of us have campaigned for such a mechanism for nearly 12 years since the end of the Civil War. Eventually, the United Nations Human Rights Council for Human Rights, the Sri Lankan government signed up to a mechanism, albeit one involving significant compromise by those of us who felt it didn't go far enough and who didn't trust the Sri Lankan government to deliver. Sadly, time has proven us right. The Sri Lankans didn't deliver on any of the promises made to the international community, and then last March walked away totally. It's clear the Sri Lankan government will just continue to deny, to delay, and to evade. That's why we urgently need a new international solution. The 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council is currently underway, giving the UK the opportunity to demand accountability in Sri Lanka. But regrettably, the draft resolution on Sri Lanka totally fails to rise to the challenge, even though the UK is a leader of the core group. As it stands, the draft resolution is too vague and lacks robust commitment to international accountability mechanisms. Section 6 in the resolution is simply far too weak. That's why Liberal Democrats continue to call on the UK government to work with international partners to ensure a proper international independent investigative mechanism to establish what is happening in Sri Lanka. There must be a robust international mechanism which ensures that evidence can be collected and files can be prepared for prosecution. The British Tamil community is growing frustrated at the lack of meaningful progress in finding justice, and I share this frustration. So it's time for the UK to also undertake bilateral actions to push for accountability. I've long called for an end to arms exports to Sri Lanka. With Sri Lanka listed as a human rights priority country in the Foreign Office's own recent annual human rights report, it's preposterous that arms exports are still not banned. And the government should look at Magnitsky-style sanctions against individuals involved in perpetrating human rights abuses. The truth is, Sri Lanka is part of the global struggle between the US and China. It's part of the geopolitics of our world. And it's time that democratic countries work together to support the democratic and human rights of the Tamil people and stopped allowing the Sri Lankan government to become increasingly under the influence of Beijing. It's time we stood up for the human rights of the Tamil people.
Teresa Villiers.
Thank you. I draw attention to my entry on the register of members' interests regarding a visit I made almost exactly a year ago to the UNHRC in Geneva to make the case for justice for the Tamil people. Terrible crimes were committed during the conflict in Sri Lanka. Over a decade later, as we've heard today, human rights abuses against Tamils persist. In a deeply worrying report in January, High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet highlights accelerating militarisation of civilian governmental functions, reversal of important constitutional safeguards, and political obstruction of accountability, exclusionary rhetoric and intimidation of civil society. Mr. Deputy Speaker, domestic initiatives to secure accountability for war crimes have failed to produce results, and Ms. Bachelet fears this entrenched impunity could contribute to past crimes being repeated. Not one of the individual cases identified by the UN as emblematic has led to a successful prosecution. In one of the few cases where a member of the military was convicted for murdering a Tamil, President Rajapaksa chose to issue a pardon. Some of those implicated in war crimes have even been appointed to senior positions. Over 40 civil society institutions have reported harassment and surveillance. Reporters Without Borders point to, quotes, an alarming resurgence in attacks on Tamil journalists. The Office of the UN High Commissioner continues to receive credible evidence of abductions, torture and gender-based violence by security forces. The Prevention of Terrorism Act is still used to detain people years after the Sri Lankan state promised to repeal it. Driven forward by David Cameron's government after his historic visit to Jaffna, the first by a major world leader, much hope centred on UNHRC resolutions 30/1 and 40/1. That Conservative-led government played a crucial role in securing those very, very significant resolutions. And ministers and officials under this present Conservative government continue to lead efforts to secure a tough new resolution at the HRC session underway as we speak in Geneva. Welcome progress has been made on that resolution, but the international community needs to match words and deeds. If they don't, this new resolution could run into the sand like the previous ones. So I call on the Minister today. It's time for the UK government to use its Magnitsky sanctions regime to target the men the UN believes are culpable for the atrocities that took place during the Sri Lankan Civil War. That is one of the key asks of my British Tamil constituents, and I believe that that could finally help break the deadlock and open the way for justice for Tamils and a better future for Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Much. Tamarjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and my gratitude also to the Backbench Business Committee, the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden, and all Honourable Members involved for ensuring time is given to this very important debate. There are many people in my Slough constituency with a direct interest in reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka because of their own links to that nation, because they have friends and family there, or because they are concerned about human rights. I had the pleasure of visiting this beautiful country and therefore appreciate fully the huge potential it has to succeed and prosper on the global stage. However, since the end of the tragic civil war in 2009, there has sadly not been the construction of robust human rights institutions and legal frameworks needed. And attempts at truth and reconciliation have been unsatisfactory, especially the withdrawal by the Sri Lankan government from the UN Human Rights Council resolution 30/1. There must be commitment on all sides to transparency, honesty and a willingness to show contrition. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Tamil community, victims of violence and their families must feel that their voices are being heard. This has not, sadly, been the case thus far in Sri Lanka. Within the limited time available and without wanting to repeat what other honourable members have mentioned, I want to address one very specific abuse of human rights, an issue of huge concern to Sri Lankan Muslims, Christians and other faith communities, and one which I raised just earlier this month with the Foreign Office Minister, the forced cremation of those who have died from coronavirus. As the House will know, cremation of a human body is forbidden in some religions, including Islam. The Holy Quran sanctifies the human body as made by God and forbids cremation because it contends that human remains must return to the earth. But widespread reports indicate that Sri Lankan authorities have been cremating all COVID-19 victims, regardless of religion. The Sri Lankan government's chief epidemiologist claimed that burials would, and I quote, contaminate ground drinking water. There is absolutely no medical or scientific basis for this. The World Health Organization has made it clear that human remains can be safely buried without risk of spreading COVID-19, and across the world, including right here in the UK, countries have safely buried the bodies of those who have tragically died from this virus. And whilst reports indicate that these measures are being reversed, albeit not to full satisfaction yet, this has been seen by many as being in the broader context of oppression of minorities in Sri Lanka, including Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Tamils and others. From listening to constituents, especially those worshipping at the Masjid al-Jannah now and the Council of Sri Lankan Muslim Organisations UK, as a vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Sri Lankan Muslims, I appreciate their deep pain and legitimate concerns. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when the war ended, after 25 years of death and destruction, we had hoped for a lasting peace for every citizen of Sri Lanka. We had hoped for the rule of law and universal human rights. Recent events show that we still have a long way to go yet, and our UK government must step up to the plate on the international stage and impress upon the Sri Lankan government the need to respect universal human rights and the critical need to follow the path of accountability, justice and reconciliation. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
City Link. Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for leading this debate, and a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Slough, whose remarks I agree with wholeheartedly. I declare my interest as an officer of the all-party parliamentary groups, both for Tamils, Sri Lanka, and chairing that for the Council of Sri Lankan Mosques. Now, the reality is that Sri Lanka was blighted and torn apart by a terrible, bloody civil war. And 12 years on from that ending, there are still many people who are unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to them, whether they were killed, whether they're in graves somewhere, or whether they dispersed around the world. Now, 9 years ago, I joined with others in visiting Sri Lanka ahead of CHOGM and seeing at first hand the work that was being done in Jaffna. And that heralded the visit then by former Prime Minister David Cameron, which was deeply an historic visit. I saw at first hand the mine clearance that was going on and also the clearance of areas for fishing so that the Tamil people could return to being able to farm and to fish for their own population and for exports. My constituent, Ambahai Selvakumar, has been referred to earlier. She lives in Kenton in Harrow and has been on hunger strike in relation to seeking justice for the Tamil people. I hope her campaign will be successful, but I would caution her to say that her life is more important at the moment than ensuring that we get the British government and others around the world to shift their views. I would commend the report, which highlights the abuses which minority religions in Sri Lanka. Clearly something that we should all draw attention to, and I would commend as well the report by Real Other, who are an organisation that have put together the position in Sri Lanka. They took 32 days, right? It draws not just to the forced cremation issues, but also the other suffering that the Muslim minority are in Sri Lanka right now. Remember, most of the design, there are all sorts of atrocities against the minority Muslims across Sri Lanka. Now, the reality is that there is deeply religious persecution going on in Sri Lanka, where there's a majority, big majority of Buddhists against all the minority religions. I was recently able to lead a virtual delegation to the UN Human Rights Council on behalf of Cosmos and actually draw attention of the Human Rights Council to the atrocities being subjected to the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. It is key that the resolutions that the Human Rights Council are strengthened. And I would urge my honourable friend, the Minister, when he rises, to give a deep commitment to ensure that we act as a country to strengthen the resolutions and to make people, and particularly the leadership in Sri Lanka, face up to their responsibilities and ensure that religious persecution ends and that indeed the minority rights are protected. After all, that is one of our fundamental areas of international concern, And I hope that we will be leading the way rather than following.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, can I congratulate the Honourable Lady from Mitcham and Morden for setting the scene so well and with such passion as well. We endorse her commitment. I'd like to register an interest as the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief. I'm sure I speak for all members of that APPG when I express that I am very concerned about Sri Lankan government's withdrawal from its commitment to reconciliation, to accountability, to human rights. And I'm also very concerned about the treatment of religious or belief communities within Sri Lanka. The UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, visited Sri Lanka and noted that there were frequent reports of acts of intolerance and the failure of the state to protect individuals and communities targeted by such hostility. Dr. Shahid also said Muslim communities and new Christian churches face a range of harassment and assaults that ranges from interruption, damage to places of worship, physical assaults on clergy, intimidation, mob violence, restricting the use of places of worship, the obstruction of religious rights, incitement to violence, and many, many other acts of intolerance. Indeed, since the beginning of 2015 to the end of June 2019, the National Christian Evangelical Alliance of Sri Lanka has documented an estimated 387 attacks or violations targeting Christians specifically. When it comes to Muslims in Sri Lanka, according to CSW, religious intolerance towards that community predates the 2019 Easter bombings. Many propagators of hate speech towards Muslims play on the economic factors, and anti-Muslim rumours are also a regular feature of life on Sri Lankan social media. Since the bombings, Sri Lankan Muslims have faced an upsurge in violation of their basic rights, as well as assaults and indeed other abuse. And this lack of accountability that abusers and perpetrators of violence face in Sri Lanka is a problem that was raised by many different communities to the Special Rapporteur. The unwillingness of the authorities to protect communities against threats and acts of violence. And we have to address the issue of the legal basis, as the Sri Lankan government constitution declares. Buddhism shall be given the foremost place by the state. And a 2003 Supreme Court ruling determined that the state was constitutionally required to protect only Buddhism. This gross violation of human rights puts into law the government's refusal to treat all religious or belief communities fairly. They should all be treated the same. Sri Lankan state is particularly not responsive to violence and abuse against women. Women's experience of ethnic religious hostility, including the violence, the displacement and the stereotyping, do not receive attention or redress. Women also experience gender-specific hate speech and human rights violations. And moreover, women's human rights activists appear to be at risk from fundamentalist members in their own religious communities. I, as others have said, expressed some concern over the government forcing cremation upon Muslims and Christians and those of other ethnic groups, and this, I believe, is against the human rights of every one of those different religions, and to be based on absolutely no scientific or medical evidence, I think also gives me great concern. I would like to see that those in position of power are made accountable for their war crimes by bringing them to court, take away their assets and their travel bans. And Sri Lanka, with the influence of hate speech, legal discrimination and impunity for violent actors, will only serve to cause more conflict and violence in Sri Lanka in the long run. I always like to leave a scripture text, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do that in all these debates because it's important to do so. Galatians chapter 6 verses 2, and it says, it urges us, every one of us, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. The people of Sri Lanka, I believe, are crying out for that very help. I urge the Minister, for the sake of every community in Sri Lanka, to use all channels available to him to encourage his Sri Lankan counterparts to commit to UN Human Rights Council resolution of the 30th of March and to the protection of freedom of religion or belief for all. We are here to speak up for those who have no voice. Thank you.
Biddy Link, Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate not just the Honourable Lady from Mitcham and Morden, but a collection of near neighbours of mine to the north for securing this speech. I do, Mr Deputy Speaker, have a vivid memory of being in Sri Lanka a few years ago as warplanes passed overhead, heading in the direction of the Tamil areas of the country. A very stark reminder of the turmoil that country has experienced. And whilst I'm in no doubt that there were sometimes dreadful deeds on both sides of the civil war, it is the plight of the Tamil community particularly which rightly attracts international concern. And I remember particularly that concern taking David Cameron to Jaffna when he was Prime Minister.
it's concern which is rightly shared by politicians across this House today. There can be no winners from the racial strife that continues to dog Sri Lanka today, and nor is it easy to see how that strife can end without accountability for what happened and genuine efforts for reconciliation between the two communities. And I know from my own constituency and the Tamil community that lives and worships here, how strong the sense of resentment and anger still is amongst that community, and also how very real and strong the concerns are for surviving relatives still in Sri Lanka. Many of my constituents lost relatives during the Civil War. Many of them still fear for relatives in today's Sri Lanka, where it's clear that the pressures on the Tamil community have not gone away. It is a tragedy. I also represent a community with members of the Sinhalese community living and working in it, playing an important part, for example, in our NHS. These are communities that should be able, back in Sri Lanka, to find a way of living alongside each other in peace and friendship. But unless that can eventually happen, there will be no long-term stability for the country. So I welcome the UK's move to lead the UNHRC resolution on Sri Lanka. That resolution would provide a framework for continued international engagement on human rights and post-conflict accountability. It calls on the government of Sri Lanka to investigate and prosecute all allegations of gross human rights violations and serious violations of international law, and it highlights concerns about the human rights situation, including particularly concerns about the protection of Tamils. And I'd say today, these are the minimum necessary to start Sri Lanka back on the road to justice and stability. Now, we've heard quite a bit this afternoon about the hunger strike by Mrs. Salva Kumar here in the UK to highlight the need for action on Sri Lanka. But whether or not you support the approach that she took, and I happen to agree with the member for Harrow about the importance of her life, the fact that she chose to do this serves to underline the frustration in the Tamil community about how much still has to be done. And it's my hope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the Sri Lankan government is listening to this debate, listening to the cross-party contributions, because this is an issue that unites members on all sides of the House. I hope that they will be provoked to think about their future and what's in the interest of their country. Because in the end, no government succeeds by failing to respect the rights of all of its citizens. In the end, the damage to its international reputation feeds through to its economy and to all other aspects of its interaction with the world. So it really is time now for the government in Colombo to act in its national interest, to recognise the deep international concern about what has happened and what is still happening, and once and for all put things right. Because unless there is justice in Sri Lanka for everyone, and justice for all those members of the Tamil community, that potentially great country will never in reality be able to fulfil its potential. And I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, without justice, its reputation in the world will remain seriously tarnished. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thank you to Honourable friend Mitchell Morden for securing this important debate, important to so many people in Ilford, both north and south. 12 years we now are, Mr. Speaker, after the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, and the latest UN report on the country's human rights situation paints an extremely worrying picture. Since 2019, the situation in Sri Lanka has rapidly deteriorated. Widespread reports of torture and oppression, the reintroduction of the death penalty for certain drug offences, antagonistic behaviour such as demolition of the Mulivaikal Memorial at the University of Jaffna, and the appointment of military officials such as General Silva to positions of authority are deeply troubling to people across Ilford. And in 2015, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights completed a thorough investigation into the abuses by all parties in the Sri Lankan armed conflict, mandated by a UN Human Rights Council resolution, and it found strong and corroborated evidence that the 58th Division, led by Shavendra Silva, had extrajudicially executed surrendering soldiers and shelled marked civilian hospitals. The Sri Lankan government recently passed the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which is seen by many as a significant challenge to democratic governance. The amendment, which has been opposed by civil society and religious leaders, removes almost all checks on the power of the executive president. Campaign groups say that this also further undermines the judiciary's independence by allowing the president complete control over senior judicial appointments. And in her latest report, the UN Human Rights Commissioner said that she is deeply concerned about the increased use of ethno-nationalistic and majoritarian rhetoric and symbols by the President, and other senior government figures have warned of return to violence. She also called for a referral to the ICC and targeted sanctions against Sri Lankan officials found in contravention of human rights. And despite these troubling reports, the UK government has provided several £1 million recently in security assistance to Sri Lanka to aid training and capacity building of the Sri Lankan police and security forces. And in 2019, the FCO announced another 3-year programme under its Conflict Stability and Security Fund, totaling £3 million, which would include supporting police development and strengthening of the defence relationship. So I urge the government, as I previously have in this House, to publish an assessment of the impact of the financial support of the Overseas Security and Justice assessments for activities under this programme, because I want to be confident, and the people of Ilford South want to be confident, that we are not supporting human rights violations. Let's be clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Labour Party is committed to defending the rule of law and human rights across the world, and it's troubling that the Foreign Secretary was recently recorded saying the UK could pursue trade deals with governments that commit human rights abuses. I wonder, does that include the Sri Lankan government as well? And it is deeply concerning that the government is yet to implement its Magnitsky sanctions against members of the Sri Lankan government who are found to be complicit in serious human rights abuses. In the UK, making an outlier amongst its allies. And in February of last year, 2020, the US State Department designated General Silver under the Department of State Foreign Operations and Related Programs Appropriations Act, banning him and his immediate family from entry into the United States. Various civil rights groups and NGOs have also expressed their concerns that £6.3 million of UK taxpayers' money has recently been spent on supporting security reform in Sri Lanka. It has only enabled the Sri Lankan security forces to advance antagonistic activities, including accelerated destruction of places of worship and cultural heritage, and, as I already mentioned, the terrible events at the Memorial University of Jaffna. And indeed, further reports widely of torture and oppression by state actors. Thousands of Sri Lankan Tamil community in my constituency are deeply concerned about this, Mr Speaker. They want to see that this government put human rights at the centre of our foreign policy and any future dealings with the Sri Lankan government, working towards a political solution that includes the self-determination of the Tamil people of the island of Sri Lanka.
Senator Magnol.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member from Mitcham and Morden in securing this debate and for her work both in this chamber and in Westminster Hall debates in raising this point, and it's a pleasure to be able to take part. And if I may also associate myself with the words from the member for Chipping Barnet in relation to the Magnitsky Act and making sure that we use the full potential to ensure that we can bring people to justice who are committing human rights violations. And as ever, it's always a pleasure to be in the same debates as the member for Strangford, and I appreciate what he said. Mr Deputy Speaker, I stand as a chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Preventing Sexual Violence, and I'd like to address in the course of my remarks how we could use the PSVI initiative to tackle some of the human rights violations and abuses that have been identified by so many members of this House. But of course, by background, and many have already said it, the progress that has been made since 2009 has been incredibly limited. And in fact, the Sri Lankan government's decision to reverse their position is one of grave concern. In recent weeks and months, we've heard the Foreign Secretary talk about the need for the UNHCR to restore its reputation, to make sure that it acts on human rights violations. Well, I would say that we too can do well to listen to that advice, that the international community, at a point in which it is fractured and divided, could again become united and to stand together in addressing the violations of human rights of countries around the world, and Sri Lanka would be a good place to start. A recent report from the UN states that there continues to be credible allegations through well-known human rights organisations of abductions, tortures and sexual violence by Sri Lankan security forces. And since the adoption of Resolution 31, including in the past year. Now, the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative was set up on the basis of helping those who are, as it says in the name, who have endured sexual violence in conflict and crisis zones. And the UK, when it set it up in 2012 and 2014, was able to engage international cooperation to be able to ensure that resolutions in the UN could pass, but that documentation could be provided of crimes that are going on across the globe, that survivors could be supported, and that potential prosecutions in future years could be delivered. Now, if the organisations that are currently set up are failing to deliver that, then could I suggest that we push forward to create our own new international body that can help document these crimes, can help support survivors, and can help lead international prosecutions. Out of every great conflict and crisis that has happened throughout mankind, great new reforming bodies have come, and this should be no exception. I'd like to make two final points in the time that I have. Is that this year there is the Commonwealth Heads of Government in Rwanda, and we, as always has been the case, we should be able to speak truth to our friends. It would be a missed opportunity for us to not speak clearly at the Commonwealth Heads of Government mission in Rwanda about what has happened in Rwanda, to ensure that there can be cooperation to be able to address the human rights violations that have happened. And secondly, to make sure that at the G7 we are raising these issues, to be able to provide the support for those who have endured human rights violations, to ensure that those perpetrators are brought to justice, to ensure that the culture of impunity is shattered. We have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do not believe it to be bravado, to say that we can lead the international community to take action, to help safeguard human rights, and to lead by example. And I hope we can do so.
Lydia Link. Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The seriousness and urgency of this debate cannot be understated. The current presidential administration of Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his brother Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa stand accused of multiple historic and ongoing human rights violations. The administration continues to prevent any accountability from the Sri Lankan military, many of whose leaders stand credibly accused of innumerable war crimes in the Sri Lankan civil war. These leaders include Army Commander Shivendra Silva and Secretary of Defence Kamal Gunaratne, who are accused of deliberately shelling hospitals and civilians, involvement in sexual violence, extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearances. During the Civil War, an estimated 100,000 people were forcibly disappeared. These disappearances have affected all communities, but the bulk of the victims were Tamils. Forced disappearances have also occurred in Sri Lanka before the war, when hundreds of students in the south of the country were disappeared and in its aftermath. The vast majority of these cases remain unresolved, and attempts by relatives of the victims to attain justice have provoked visceral resistance from the Sri Lankan state. In February 2017, the relatives of the disappeared in the north and east, mainly Tamil women, began a continuous protest seeking the truth about what happened to their loved ones, and at least 78 of the protesters have sadly passed away since the beginning of the protests, without ever learning the truth about what happened to their families. There is at present no prospect that these families will ever know real accountability from officials responsible via the domestic justice system in Sri Lanka, whose independence has been severely compromised by the Rajapaksa administration. However, this does not mean we're without options to defend the human rights of Sri Lankan citizens. The US applied sanctions on Army Commander Silva for his complicity in human rights abuses in February last year. The UK should immediately follow in designating both General Silva and Secretary of Defence Gunaratne on the UK sanctions list. Furthermore, given the Sri Lankan military's continued complicity in preventing any real accountability for historic and ongoing crimes against humanity, we should immediately halt UK defence engagement with the Sri Lanka Armed Forces and withdraw our resident defence advisor in Colombo. This post was established in January 2019, and I quote, to hasten the development of a modern, accountable and human rights compliant military. But all the post is created as a legitimation mechanism for the Sri Lankan military and state. The UK has a long record of training Sri Lankan military and security forces on human rights issues, but there's no evidence of significant changes in the approach of the military to human rights, nor effective vetting or accountability in the army for those accused of serious human rights violations. The UK cannot remain complicit in these grievous crimes. If our engagement is truly aimed at preventing further human rights violations, it must take real steps to remind the Sri Lankan government that they cannot expect military engagement and support unless those human rights violations are addressed. Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I hope the UK Government takes these considerations on board and acts accordingly, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this backbench business debate today. Thank you.
Thank you. Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd also like to draw members' attention to my register of members' interests, because like the Right Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet, this time last year, just as the seriousness of the pandemic had become clear in our country, days before formal lockdown was introduced, I too was in Geneva lobbying delegations and missions to the UN Human Rights Council about the need for firm action at a UN level as a result of both the failure of the government of Sri Lanka to honour the existing commitments that have been made, but also, as we've heard during the debate, the ongoing human rights abuses in that country. My honourable friend, the member for Mitcham Morden, set out perfectly well both the historic context and the ongoing challenges in the country. And I'm afraid, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's with a sense of deja vu that I participate in this afternoon's debate, because we've been here so many times before discussing exactly the same issues, the appalling atrocities committed during the Civil War, both the literal scars and also the emotional scars that survivors of that conflict continue to feel to this very day. The disappearance of families still unresolved, and the responsibility that rests on the government of Sri Lanka to promote truth, justice and reconciliation for all the peoples of Sri Lanka. And it had felt that we had begun to make progress. We had seen through successive UN Human Rights Council resolutions not just the focus of the international community, but the government of Sri Lanka signing up to commitments before the international community, including a commitment for international involvement in the investigation and prosecution of allegations of historic war crimes. The commitment made before the eyes of the entire international community to put a stop to ongoing human rights violations. But what do we see, both from the report of the UN Human Rights Commissioner, as well as a wide range of independent international NGOs? We see a picture described by the UN of the last 12 months fundamentally changing the environment for advancing reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. The erosion of democratic checks and balances in the civic space, threats to reverse the limited, and I emphasise limited, I thought the member for Hendon was far too generous in his assessment, the limited gains made in recent years. The risk of return to policies and practice that gave rise to the grave violations of the past. Indeed, as we heard from my friend the member for Mitcham and Morden, not only do we have a government that's withdrawn from the commitments that Sri Lanka made to the international community, we have the same cast of characters that were responsible for perpetrating human rights abuses during the Civil War back in power and resistant to any sense that they should be at all accountable both for their historic actions and for ongoing human rights violations. So my question to the Minister is, what is now going to change beyond this resolution to change the experience, the lived experience of people in Sri Lanka and the Tamil community in Sri Lanka and around the world that are seeking accountability and justice for historic crimes? As we've heard, it's not just the case that the international community can take action, and I agree with the arguments already made about the importance of CHOGM and the G7. We are able to take bilateral action to apply Magnitsky sanctions against the rogues and the criminals that perpetrated human rights abuses. And it's at this point, after many years of campaigning for justice, that my Tamil constituents aren't just looking for warm words, they're looking for action and leadership, which has been missing from the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister.
Video link. John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I agree with the Honourable Gentleman from Inford North. How many more times do we have to be here before we get firm action? I want to thank the Honourable Members who've secured this vitally important debate. And I also want to pay tribute to all my constituents and the community groups who have contacted me to express their views about the situation deteriorating in Sri Lanka. All of them, especially from the Tamil community, have impressed upon me the need for decisive international action to secure what? just a peaceful and just future for the country. These next few days in the run-up to the UN Human Rights Council on Monday are critical to securing a meaningful international intervention that could lead to that better future. That's why I do support the call in this debate for urgent action from the highest levels of our government, in particular the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, to ensure that the resolution is strengthened for Monday and also that the vote is overwhelmingly carried. And I urge the government to draw upon the full range of our diplomatic relationships, especially our friends in the Commonwealth countries in Africa and Asia. Many of us have been shocked but not surprised at the latest report in January on the situation in Sri Lanka from the UN Human Rights Commissioner. It sets out straightforwardly the litany of the concerns that our own constituents have drawn our attention to. The failure of the Sri Lankan government to address past human rights violations, the closing down of the space for independent voices, the intimidation of civil society alongside a deepening attitude of acting with impunity within the government, and a visible and increased militarization of the civil administration. And yes, the rise of ethno-nationalism and hate speech, and there clearly has been a concerted and targeted attack on the rights of Tamil and Muslim communities. And I repeat what others have said, the seriousness of these issues means that the UK government must throw its full diplomatic weight behind the strengthening of the UNCR resolution and make sure that we follow it through the implementation. But it is vitally important, exactly as my honourable friend for Ilford North said, we should recognise that the adoption of the resolution does not preclude individual countries like ours from taking their own additional unilateral action. I believe that this country has a special responsibility for action as the former colonial power. It was us who united the three kingdoms, one of them that was a Tamil kingdom, into one country and then left in 1948. I want to go through the three distinct actions that the government should undertake, the UK government should undertake unilaterally. And this is the only way I think that we can prove we're serious about holding the Sri Lankan government into a regime to account. First, we've got to ensure that all trade and aid agreements with Sri Lanka are actually only granted following the full ratification and enactment of by the Sri Lankan government of the Human Rights Conventions of the UN, but also to fulfill their pledge to scrap the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Secondly, I support all those members who said that we should be using the Magnitsky provisions that we've recently put into legislation to ensure that we take action against those individuals that are accused of gross human rights violations. And then finally, yes, we've got to ensure that we fully fund and support bodies investigating human rights abuses, war crimes, and yes, indeed, making sure that we also bring onto the agenda the genocidal claims that were undertaken during the war in Sri Lanka.
Video link. Tayo Awatemi.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is an honour to speak in this debate about a situation that should concern all of us. And I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for leading this debate. I've been contacted by a number of my constituents in Coventry North West, for whom the pain and suffering caused by the civil wars in Sri Lanka and the persecution of the Tamil community is still very real. And many of us have been contacted about the hunger strikes currently undertaken by Mrs. Salvakuma. The fact that Mrs. Salvakuma feels that this is the only way to get her voice heard is deeply saddening. The move away from the UN Human Rights Council resolution this past year by the government of Sri Lanka is very troubling, and the ongoing human rights issues in that country must be a priority for the government as they focus our foreign policy on the Indo-Pacific region. The 30-year civil war between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam saw continuous and terrible human rights abuses by both parties. When the war ended in 2009, it was hoped that finally Sri Lanka might find peace and a chance to reconcile and heal the divisions that have beset the country since independence. But progress has been slow and halting at best, and since the Sri Lankan government removed itself as a co-sponsor from the UNHRC resolution, there have been increasing concerns about their commitments to peace and justice. Trends emerging in this past year have represented a clear, early warning sign of a deteriorating situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. We have seen an acceleration of the militarization of civilian government functions, the erosion of the independence of the judiciary and key institutions, increased marginalization of the Tamil and Muslim communities, and even the destruction of a memorial to the victims of the war. There is ongoing impunity and obstruction of accountability for the crimes and human rights violations that have occurred. Victims and their family are calling out for international accountability, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has requested that members of the UNHRC cooperate with victims and their representatives to investigate and indeed prosecute international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka. Our government must commit to doing all that it can to make these crimes, to have these crimes investigated and the perpetrators prosecuted. The British government created the Global Human Rights Action Regime Act in order to prevent the impunity enjoyed by perpetrators of serious human rights abuses. So, will the government commit to using these sanctions to prevent further abuses in Sri Lanka? It has already announced a shift in foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region, but our foreign policy and trade agreements must not come at a cost of people and their lives. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is imperative that the government commits to prioritising human rights as a cornerstone of our foreign and trade policy in this region. And I hope that it would not put trade and indeed profits before the interest of human lives. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. Video link. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome this debate. The resolution to be voted on next week comes at a crucial time. It should make a reference to the International Criminal Court, as my honourable friend for Mitcham and Morden argued in so powerfully opening this debate. The evidence gathering element is crucial to maintain material for the international accountability which Sri Lanka has resisted for so long, but which must in due course come. And I welcome the proposed commitment to regular report backs on the conditions in Sri Lanka. As others have reminded of the House, we now have a UK mechanism for sanctions against those guilty of human rights atrocities. Will we sanction those guilty in Sri Lanka? The US has rightly designated Army Commander Shavendra Silva, mentioned already. He led the ground assault on the beaches of Mullivai-Kal at the end of the Civil War, attacking civilians, hospitals, medical staff, no fire zones. Will we now do so too? Kamal Gunaratne, now Defence Secretary, led a February 2009 assault attacking civilian hospitals and food distribution points. He commanded the Joseph Army Camp, notorious for torture after the war. The UN has named him. Will we sanction him? And why on earth, Mr. Deputy Speaker, do we have a resident defence advisor in Colombo providing training and legitimacy? He's met at least 5 people credibly accused of mass atrocities. Surely that advisor must now be withdrawn. Before the 2019 Sri Lanka election, the government there paid lip service to the Human Rights Council resolution they co-sponsored with the UK after David Cameron visited as Prime Minister. The calculation seemed to be if the government gave lip service to engaging, the international community would leave them alone. And they were right. There was no serious effort to hold Sri Lanka to account. The new government, elected in 2019, includes, as we've heard, guilty men. It's no longer pretending, it's simply withdrawn. The Sri Lanka campaign, which has Tamil, Muslim and Sinhalese support, said last month, and I quote, "Respect for the rule of law and human rights have demonstrably diminished. The current government has significantly reversed progress on 15 of the 25 commitments under Resolution 31 one and halted progress on 7 others. The President now controls all senior judicial appointments. In a climate of fear, human rights defenders and victim survivors are watched and harassed, human rights lawyers held without charge. We've been reminded of the presidential pardon for one of the only soldiers ever convicted for a wartime atrocity. Other key cases have collapsed. Witnesses and victims are intimidated. Senior police officers taken off investigations. The former Criminal Investigations Department head arrested. The President has promoted war criminals. 4 government departments are led by former military commanders. Military intelligence officers run COVID contact tracing, threatening activists and victims. Muslims, as we've been reminded, are targeted. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Human Rights Council must pass an ambitious resolution next week.
Link. Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Sri Lanka, as others have already alluded to, is a stunningly beautiful island. But to be one of its Tamil citizens, increasingly to be one of its Muslim citizens, and certainly to be Sinhalese and interested in human rights or an opponent of the Rajapaksa family, it is a very dangerous country. Many of those who are Tamil who live in my constituency believe that nothing short of a genocide continues to take place against Tamil citizens in Sri Lanka. With Tamil citizens increasingly, they believe, viewed by the Sri Lankan government in the same apparent way as the Chinese government views the Uyghurs. There is deep, deep frustration with the apparent impunity of the Rajapaksa family and their supporters from either domestic or international accountability. There's anger with the current UK government for its tolerance of that impunity and its complicity at international level in failing thus far to get action taken by the international community against the Sri Lankan government. There is disbelief too that Tamil refugees might be returned to a country so obviously ravaged by human rights abuses. And there is a demand similar to those that, as others have expressed, for Britain to use the powers it does have at its disposal already to hold to account those clearly implicated in serious human rights abuses, as many in the debate have already alluded to, not least my right honourable friend who's just spoken. And indeed, to take action as was recommended by the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. And lastly, the Tamil community want ministers to back a call for Sri Lanka to be referred to the International Criminal Court. A number of members have already referenced the courage of Mrs. Ambihai Selvakuna in her recent hunger strike, which I'm pleased to say, for her sake, has ended, but which did serve to draw international attention to the issues that we are debating today. As my honourable friend from Mitcham and Morden said in her excellent speech, the frustration of the international community and the Tamil community in many of our constituencies dates back to the end of the conflict in 2009, where terrible war crimes were committed against the Tamil community, those civilians and those surrendering at the end of the conflict. No one has ever been held accountable for those crimes. I strongly support the call by Michelle Bachelet, echoed by my honourable friends today, for Britain to use the emergency sanctions that it does have available to it against Shivendra Selva and Gamal Gunaratne. In the short amount of time that I have left, I also wanted to praise the recent Amnesty International report and to note the important contribution from Freedom from Torture, urging the Home Office to take another look with the Foreign Office at the country note that it uses to judge whether or not people should be returned, refugees should be returned to Sri Lanka. Quite clearly, given the scale of torture and other human rights abuses, it would be totally wrong to return people with credible concerns about the situation in Sri Lanka there. I look forward to the Minister finally taking some serious action against Sri Lanka.
We now move to the wind-ups, and for 6 minutes, Anne McLaughlin.
Mr Speaker, I congratulate the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for a speech that I know will have moved many of my friends here and in Sri Lanka, as it did me. I also know she and others in this debate have been good and consistent friends to those campaigning for truth, justice and accountability in Sri Lanka. Mr Speaker, I won't repeat all that we've heard about what happened during the 30-year-long war. I will instead focus on what's happened or not happened since. It is a crime against humanity itself that nobody has been found accountable since this war ended 12 years ago. There's been a sleight of hand performance between then and now, with successive governments promising the international community and their own people that they will do X, Y and Z, then drawing back, then promising again. But at the end of the day, progress is never made, accountability never happens, reconciliation is never credibly attempted, and peace never really comes to this beautiful island. And I know exactly how beautiful it is and its people, because I lived and worked in Gaul on the south coast for a short time during the Civil War. I cannot claim to have suffered because of it, but I certainly met many people who were suffering. I certainly heard stories and rumours of what was going on at the time. It was in the years afterwards, however, when I returned just after the war and was finally able to travel to the north, and on 2 further visits, that I heard firsthand what had happened to people. They were still frightened. In fact, one man gave me a copy of the book he'd written about his account of the abuses against the Tamil community. He was so afraid of what might happen to me should I be caught reading it, that he removed the cover and replaced it with another. So it was in those visits I made in the years after the war that I got a clearer picture of what had happened. And it was from my constituents as a member of the Scottish Parliament from 2009 to 11, from friends who stayed on to help rebuild Sri Lanka, and from the people in Sri Lanka that I've kept in touch with for the last 13 years, that I got to understand more about what had happened, about the IDP camps, the missing people, the torture, the sexual violence, the shelling of so-called no-fire zones. And the reason for the debate today is to urge the UK government to do more. The Sirisena government of 2015, about whom I was somewhat cynical, did co-sponsor the UN Human Rights Council resolution, and it was hoped that this would encourage thorough investigations into civil war crimes. To an extent it did, in that it established institutions with the functions of addressing the impact of the war. However, not much more happened, and the operation of these institutions has been hampered by successive governments. I'll also acknowledge that the UK government have played a vital role as leaders of the core group on Sri Lanka within the Human Rights Council. But it's clear now which direction the Sri Lankan government is heading in, and the UK government must step up its commitment to reconciliation, accountability and human rights. Separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary have been grossly undermined by amendments to the Constitution. I believe the 20th Amendment, which removes almost every check on the executive powers of the President, to be the most significant signal that there is no respect for the rule of law. Donald Trump is an amateur compared to this guy. This new government is led by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the Defence Secretary in the final throes of the war. This president's brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the president at the time of the Civil War, has been appointed as Prime Minister, and we've heard about the 9 other family members holding senior positions in that government. The Rajapaksa brothers are credibly accused of a host of crimes during the war and of violating international humanitarian and human rights law. Yet here they are, President and Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, all the checks and balances removed. They have consistently blocked, undermined and obstructed investigations in court cases. The missing are still missing. As we've heard, the President recently pardoned a soldier, one of the few ever to be tried, never mind found guilty. This soldier was guilty of the killing of 8 Tamil civilians, including a 5-year-old child and 2 teenagers. I can only assume this was all part of his promise to end what he calls the era of betraying war heroes. As an MSP, I met 2 teenage girls living in Glasgow. They were Tamils who'd sought asylum because as children, they had watched their father being shot to death in front of them by a Sri Lankan army soldier. He made them watch as he put a bullet through their dad's brain. Should that soldier be tried, or should he be hailed as a war hero, while the world looks on, simply shrugging its shoulders? Mr Speaker, I back calls on the UK Government from previous speakers and the Sri Lanka campaign for peace and justice, and I'll reiterate just a few of those. In terms of trade, Sri Lanka should be removed from the enhanced framework level until it meets the conditions set and agreed to repeal the Prevention of Terror Act, an act which allows arbitrary detention and strips the rights to due process for those detained. Our armed forces need to stop training their army until they satisfy the conditions, again, set and agreed to on human rights. And the Minister needs to establish a screening policy for diplomatic meetings so that the UK is no longer giving legitimacy to individuals credibly accused of war crimes. Finally, Mr Speaker, I would suggest that we engage the global human rights sanction regulations to apply sanctions against individuals credibly accused of involvement in mass atrocities. Shavendra Silva would be a start. It's the very least the victims of this war, both living and dead, both here and there, can expect from us.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and may I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Mitcham and Morden, for securing this vitally important debate. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the members for Brent Central, Slough, Ilford South, Ilford North, Hayes and Harlington, Coventry North West, East Ham and Harrow West, who made truly powerful and moving contributions to this debate. I think the really strong showing that we've seen in this debate from these benches shows the central importance of this issue to our party. The Labour Party puts the rule of law, democracy and universal human rights at the very heart of our foreign policy, and we expect these principles to be upheld consistently in every country across the world, including Sri Lanka. We will always stand up for the universal rights and freedoms of all citizens when national governments refuse to live up to their international obligations. In 2009, in the final few months of Sri Lanka's long and brutal civil war, tens of thousands of civilians, mostly from the Tamil community, lost their lives. It is a scar on the conscience of the world that no one has been held accountable for these crimes, which include the deliberate shelling of civilian targets, sexual violence and extrajudicial executions. The shocking lack of accountability for past atrocities is compounded by the fact that the human rights violations in Sri Lanka continue to this day. Respected NGO Freedom from Torture has forensically documented more than 300 cases of torture by the Sri Lankan state since the war ended, and it continues to receive referrals for Sri Lankan individuals today. Mr Deputy Speaker, the people of Sri Lanka, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, deserve justice. Those responsible must be held accountable, and peace and freedom must be secured for future generations. The Labour Party is therefore deeply troubled by what has been taking place in Sri Lanka since the election of Gotabaya Rajapaksa in December 2019. Firstly, he has militarised his government by appointing former soldiers such as Shavendra Silva and Kamal Gunaratne, who both stand accused of crimes against humanity, to key positions in his cabinet. Secondly, he's done huge damage to his government's credibility in the eyes of the international community by withdrawing from UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1, which sets out a process for delivering accountability for war crimes. Thirdly, we are profoundly concerned by reports of the forced cremation of victims of COVID-19, including those of Muslim and Christian faith for whom burial rituals and traditions are sacred. The World Health Organization has issued guidance stating that the burial of COVID-19 dead poses no danger to public health. Moving to the UNHRC resolution, I've written to the Minister twice in recent weeks and months regarding these issues, and made it clear that the UK has a crucial and unique responsibility as the penholder at the UN Human Rights Council for Sri Lanka to show moral and political leadership in its approach to coordinating the international response. The final version of the draft resolution, which is set to replace 30/1, is certainly an improvement on the zero draft. However, we on these benches continue to have real concerns about key aspects of it, and I therefore have the following questions for the Minister. First, it fails to incorporate the recommendations made by the High Commissioner in her report of the 27th of January regarding universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction. We should be supporting the High Commissioner's view that the principles of universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction should apply, and that states should pursue investigations and prosecutions in their national courts. Why has the government failed to include an explicit commitment to this in the resolution? Second, the suggested evidence gathering mechanism is clearly a step in the right direction, but it stops short of recommending the establishment of a fully fledged international independent investigative mechanism known as IIIM. Why has the government failed to include a commitment to IIIM in its final draft? Third, it is clear that there is a strong basis for referring a number of senior members of the Sri Lankan military and government to the International Criminal Court. Why has the government failed to include such a recommendation in this resolution? We know that 2 of the permanent members of the UN will likely block such action, but should the position of the government really be shaped by the veto-wielding intentions of China and Russia? Fourth, there is nothing in the resolution about prevention. Why doesn't the resolution include explicit reference to protecting human rights defenders? Are British diplomats travelling on a regular basis to the north and east of Sri Lanka to assess the situation on the ground? 5. The draft resolution requests a report on accountability options in 18 months. This is an unacceptably long timeline, given the evidence already available, and will give the Sri Lankan government yet more time to obstruct and obfuscate. Why has the government failed to ensure that the resolution is based on a far shorter report-back timeline of 6 months, as I recommended in my recent letter to the Minister? Moving beyond the UN resolution, there are a number of bilateral steps that the government should be taking. In my letter to the Minister of the 11th of December last year, I suggested that a number of Sri Lankan officials should be sanctioned under the government's global human rights sanctions regime, yet not a single Sri Lankan government minister, official or military officer has been designated. Could the Minister please explain why it's taking so long when the evidence is already widely available? In my letter, I also raised the issue of the UK Defence Advisor's engagement with the Sri Lankan military. Since arriving in Colombo in January last year, he has met with at least 4 senior commanders of the Sri Lankan military who stand accused of gross human rights violations. Can the Minister please explain how the activities of the Defence Advisor will lead to greater accountability for the Sri Lankan military? Are the UK government vetting who the advisor meets? Is the advisor's defence engagement delivering tangible results, or is it simply lending a veneer of legitimacy to a military that is committing human rights abuses? Thanks to the recent leaking of comments made by the Foreign Secretary, we know that he's perfectly happy to pursue trade deals with governments that are committing human rights abuses. Is the UK government pursuing a trade deal with Sri Lanka? Will human rights conditions be applied? As an EU member state, the UK was party to trading arrangements which offered a preferential tariff to Sri Lanka under the General Scheme of Preferences Enhanced Framework known as GSP+, because the Sri Lankan government was supposedly living up to its human rights obligations. Now that the UK has left the EU, will the government be reassessing its trading relationship with Sri Lanka? And here's one for the SNP spokesperson, to be answered another time, I guess, if she's still tuned in. Police Scotland have made 90 deployments of officers to Sri Lanka over the past 15 years. Have these deployments achieved tangible results, or are they just lending a veneer of credibility? And finally, what assessment has the Minister made of Sri Lankan soldiers continuing to be deployed in UN peacekeeping missions, despite the human rights record of the Sri Lankan military? Mr. Deputy Speaker, the integrated review is full of snappy slogans and rhetoric, but all it really achieved was to expose the chasm between the stated ambitions and the actual tangible actions of this government. If global Britain is to mean anything, it must surely mean consistently standing up for democracy, for the rule of law, and for universal rights and values. Not just with words, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but with deeds. That must start today, and that must start with Sri Lanka.
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm particularly grateful to the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for securing this debate, and I pay tribute to her for her work with the APG and also the work of many members across the House on this important issue, and also for the many informed and passionate contributions that we've heard this afternoon. I'll try and respond to as many of the points as raised as possible in the time I have, but I'm conscious I do believe I have to give the Honourable Lady a couple of minutes at the end of this debate to put the question. The Minister for South Asia, who would have been the Minister that the Honourable Member for Aberavon wrote to, would have been delighted to take part in this debate, but obviously he sits in the other place, so it's my pleasure to respond on his behalf and on behalf of the government. Human rights in Sri Lanka are an important issue and a long-standing priority for both for the UK government and for many fellow members. The debate's also timely, coming during the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council, which began on the 22nd of February. The human rights situation in Sri Lanka and the limited progress on reconciliation and accountability raised by many honourable and right honourable members are deeply concerning. And as pointed out by the opposition spokesman, the member for Aberavon, in February last year, the government of Sri Lanka withdrew its support for the UK-led UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1 and, of course, its successor resolutions 34/1 and 40/1. These concerned reconciliation, transitional justice and accountability. The Sri Lanka government then announced a domestic mechanism on accountability, and as with previous domestic initiatives, however, meaningful progress has yet to be delivered. There have also been a number of setbacks on accountability. These include the appointment into government positions of military figures accused of war crimes, as referenced by honourable members this afternoon. And as the honourable member for East Ham pointed out, they also include the presidential pardon of former Army Sergeant Sunil Ratnayaka, one of the few perpetrators of wartime atrocities to have been convicted in Sri Lanka. Other worrying human rights developments include the continued harassment and surveillance of minorities and civil society groups. This was pointed out by the Honourable Member for Strangford. This increasing role of the military in civilian governments and a constitutional amendment which has extended executive control over the judiciary and the independent institutions. And as the Honourable Member for Slough pointed out, the government's policy of forcibly cremating those deceased due to COVID, which has only just been recently reversed, has particularly affected the Muslim and Christian communities. And even now, our understanding is that families face significant restrictions on where and how burials can take place. The UK government is deeply concerned by these developments. We've long stood by all of the victims of the conflict in Sri Lanka. I was particularly taken by the comments of the Honourable Member for Glasgow North East, who had very personal recollections of that time. We've condemned LTTE terrorism and worked over many years to achieve post-conflict truth, accountability and transitional justice. And together with our international partners in the core group on Sri Lanka, the UK has led successive UN Human Rights Council resolutions on Sri Lanka in 2014, in 2015, in 2017 and in 2019. In February, June and September of last year, we set out our continued support for the UN Human Rights Council framework and our growing concerns about the human rights situation in core group statements to the Human Rights Council. Sri Lanka is a human rights priority country for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. In our annual reports and in Lord Ahmed's autumn ministerial statement, the government has highlighted a number of important concerns which have been highlighted here this afternoon. Accountability and human rights have also been integral to any of our bilateral discussions that we've had with the government of Sri Lanka. The Foreign Secretary underlined the importance of accountability when he spoke to the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister in May. Lord Ahmed, the Minister for South Asia, has also had numerous discussions with the Foreign Minister, most recently in January, and with the Sri Lankan High Commissioner here in London. We welcome the recent report on Sri Lanka by the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We agree with the High Commissioner that the Human Rights Council must continue to monitor the situation in Sri Lanka very closely, and we must continue to press for accountability and reconciliation. And along with our core group partners, the UK, as penholder, has presented a new draft resolution on Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council. The resolution aims to provide a continued framework for international engagements on human rights in Sri Lanka. The draft calls on the government of Sri Lanka to make progress on accountability and human rights and stresses the importance of a comprehensive accountability process for all violations and abuses committed in Sri Lanka. And it aims to keep Sri Lanka firmly on the Human Rights Council agenda and requests enhanced OHCHR reporting on the human rights situation and, importantly, on accountability. A number of honourable and right honourable members have called for an international accountability mechanism, including the member for Mitcham and Morden and Kingston and Surbiton, a mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of human rights violations as part of the resolution. I can confirm that our resolution strengthens the capacity of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to collect, consolidate, preserve and analyse evidence. The resolution supports future accountability processes and it builds on the investigations conducted under previous Human Rights Council resolutions. We're now working hard to build support for our draft, which we hope will be adopted next week. Regrettably, the Sri Lankan government has made clear its opposition to further substantive action by the Human Rights Council. Nonetheless, we will continue to seek to work constructively with them on these issues. We will underline the importance of accountability and human rights in our dialogue with the government of Sri Lanka. My right honourable friend for Epsom and Newell, honourable friend the member for Harrow East, honourable members for Brent Central and Coventry North West raised the hunger strike carried out by Ambihai Selvakumar. We understand, has been pointed out, that she was able to conclude her hunger strike 2 days ago. We absolutely recognise the concerns she's raised regarding the issues faced by the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. We've highlighted these concerns about the lack of progress towards post-conflict accountability and also the wider human rights situation. A number of honourable and right honourable members raised the question of sanctions. We established the global human rights sanction regime in July 2020, and in a statement to Parliament, the Foreign Secretary set out the full scope of the new regime without speculating, importantly, on future designations. We continue to consider further designations under this global human rights sanctions regime, and we keep all evidence and potential listings under close review. Mr Deputy Speaker, I acknowledge and welcome the strength of feeling in the House. We are right to be concerned. We will continue to prioritise international efforts to support accountability and reconciliation at this current session of the Human Rights Council, and we're pushing very hard for our resolution to be adopted next week. But I must reiterate that we can't speculate on future designations again under the global human rights sanction regime. Finally, I want to make clear we want a positive relationship with Sri Lanka. We share deep historical ties. We work well together on a number of common interests like climate change and COVID recovery, and we value that partnership. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, accountability and human rights must remain high on the agenda. Accountability and human rights to provide justice for all the victims of the conflict and for the lasting reconciliation and stability that will allow the people of Sri Lanka to prosper.
The final word, Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank all the right honourable and honourable members across the House who've taken part in this debate. Their commitment to the people, the minority community of a small island is very much appreciated. But so too, their interest is because of the hard work of the members of the Tamil community who simply cannot forget the relatives they no longer have, the relatives they have no idea where they are, the relatives who were bombed in hospitals, who were left on beaches having lost their limbs by a government now led by the same men who did that to members of their family. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is about credibility, this debate, about the credibility of the British government to take seriously the loss and distress of a community in this country, 500,000, who work hard, who do their best, who contribute greatly to our nation. Are we serious about representing them, or do we believe that governments that have powerful friends should be allowed to behave as they like? I would suggest, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the government of Sri Lanka only understands very firm action. To rely on that government to seek out those who committed those atrocities or to take action is simply a fool's errand, and it has to stop. We have to seriously mean that we will help the Tamils in this country to find their relatives, to know what happened, and allow their relatives to live in a community where they are able to vote, to take part, and to seriously believe that their views are taken seriously.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that, please say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, and we'll suspend very briefly for the cleaning of the dispatch boxes. Order!